Varying explanations about why the Rhodesian forces have gone in. Why have they gone into Mozambique?
Well, I thought it was perfectly obvious because we were in hot pursuit, and the terrorists which were being pursued went over the border, and having got over the border, we found camps and got information which led on to other camps. Now, clearly it is the duty of the Rhodesian security forces to do everything possible to defend the people of Rhodesia against the terrorist incursions. And when you find camps sitting immediately over the border, naturally you go and deal with them.
But isn't there then a very intensive operation in Mozambique? Brings the threat of escalation that much closer?
No, it's the attacks on us which have caused us to defend ourselves. If we weren't attacked, if we weren't under continual terrorist depredations, and if our people weren't being murdered the whole time, this position wouldn't exist at all.
Well, I'm with Group Capt.Tol Janeke, who has very kindly come all the way from Paarl to talk to me today. Tol is rated one of the finest operational officers that the Rhodesian Air Force produced, and his story goes right back to the beginning, having done his pilot's course in 1958. So the history of the Rhodesian Air Force is very much part of Tol's career. So I'm really pleased and privileged to have him with me today to talk about those days. Tol, thanks very much for being here, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, pleasure, Hannes. It's been a pleasant trip here to Darling, with the flowers weren't quite as good as you said they might be.
No, I'm sorry about that. But Tol, just tell us how you ended up in the Rhodesian Air Force. You're South African by birth, but you made your way to Rhodesia.
Yes, Hannes, I went to school in KwaZulu-Natal in Greytown High School, and my maths and science master there, George Parrish, encouraged me to, because I'd always been interested in aviation and flying, to join what was then the Royal Rhodesian Air Force. In order to get into the Air Force, one had to be a permanent resident of the Federation, as it was then. So I joined Barclays Bank, got a transfer to Rhodesia and my permanent residence there, and that allowed me to apply for the Air Force in 1957. Fortunately, was accepted on number 11 SSU. You know, a number of my fellow officers, guys like Sos Nederlof and Ian Harvey, Parker, Jeff Kruger, were fellow students. We got our wings, and in December 1958, and were commissioned on short service unit at that time, And I suppose after the first 2 years, the guys kind of bombshelled. You could take your small gratuity and leave, or stay on, apply to stay on a permanent commission, which is what I did. So from 1960 onwards, I became a permanent member of the Royal Rhodesian Air Force, as it was.
And Tol, just take us through just a quick tour of your career, the various commands, just the squadrons that you served on and stuff.
Yes, fine, Hannes. I was fortunate, I suppose the timing of it was fortunate, because in the late 1950s and early 60s, we were still committed with the Royal Air Force to send a squadron to the Middle East. We went to Cormaxa with number 1 squadron. I did 2 tours of operation to Cormaxa and worked with the Royal Air Force and with the army units that were there. I was also fortunate, whilst on one of those trips, to join the Lancers on a convoy. So I suppose the die was cast in working in close cooperation with the army. Those were fantastic trips to Cormaxa.
Was that Aden?
That was Aden.
Aden,
yes.
yeah. And what aircraft were you flying?
We were flying VAMPs, mainly FB9s at the time, ground attack, and were used on operations there on various strikes against dissidents in that part of the world. Mm-hmm. Later on, the Canberras, of course, got involved in Cyprus as well, and our Canberra squadrons cooperated with the Royal Air Force out of Akrotiri in Cyprus. So that was the early stages. I then, in 1962, was put onto an instructor's course and did advanced flying school instruction on number 2 squadron. One of my first instructors was Mick McLaren, who became commander of the Air Force, and I was an instructor for 4 years, advanced flying school from 62 until 66, after which I was fortunate to be posted to the Hunter Squadron, back onto number 1 squadron, and served 2 years with them before I got my first ground posting as a flight lieutenant at Air Force headquarters as Ops 2, running the operations centre there. And one of the things that's interesting about running that Ops centre was that Peter Walls was the commander of the RLI at the time, and he came into Air Force headquarters to give a briefing, and we had a large map that covered one entire wall with the disposition of his troops in the Centenary area. And what impressed me about him was that he knew the exact location of every stick of every platoon in the entire RLI. I'll never forget that. I was so impressed with his knowledge, his hands-on knowledge of what his troops, where they were and what they were doing. And he spent a good deal of time with me updating that ops map of ours.
Tol, your first engagement with the enemy, do you remember that?
The first direct engagement was a few years later, out of that Air Force headquarters job. I was given command of number 2 squadron, which was the OCU squadron, where the pilots did their operation conversion, and we were equipped with provosts and with vampires. And there had been a border crossing near Vic Falls, and we were deployed to Vic Falls with a couple of provosts. I took 2 provosts up there, and one of the patrols on the ground quite close to Vic Falls town and the Vic Falls Hotel came under fire, and we were called out to drop napalm and to do front gun attacks there, 303, Brownings the aircraft had, to try and flush the terrorists out. It was fairly late in the afternoon. It was sort of dusk. And in full view of the Victoria Falls Hotel, we carried out these attacks, and later on that evening went through to the hotel to have a drink, and there were some of the people there who'd been sitting on the veranda and were watching our attacks going in, and watching the tracer coming up at the aircraft and so on. So it was quite interesting to hear their point of view on. That was the very first operational sortie that I flew.
Tol, there was terrific cooperation between the Army and the Air Force. How did that come about? There was a very good understanding between the blue jobs and the brown jobs.
Yeah, there was an incredible understanding, and selected officers from both the Air Force and the Army, and for that matter the police, were involved in these courses. The Army run counterinsurgency courses, and I was fortunate to be on one of the first of those. And the Air Force in turn ran forward air controller, FAC courses, that the young Army commanders were invited to attend. And we got to know each other very, very well. And that stood us in incredibly good stead later on during the war, where one would recognize from the air the guy on the ground who was calling in the airstrike, and vice versa. And we were on first name terms. It made a big difference, really, because it made the war very personal. Mm-hmm. And you knew that this wasn't just an academic exercise. You were contributing very directly to the war and to the saving of lives, of people that you knew. It became that personal.
Go back to Op Hurricane and your involvement there. That all started 72 with the farm attacks, but you probably went up a bit later. But you were very involved in Op Hurricane and the jock at Mount Darwin.
Yes, I served for fairly protracted periods, both at Centenary and at Mount Darwin, and I was the Air Force rep on the Joint Operations Centre there. It was one of the early jocks that was set up, and there again, the cooperation there between the services and the internal affairs people on the ground was very, very close, incredibly good. And there are many examples of how closely we cooperated there. At one stage, and I can remember it was when Pat Armstrong was the brigade major at the time, and Dave Parker was the Army rep. I asked them if they would allow me to go on one of their deployments just as a stick member, so that I could really see what was happening on the ground. And they acceded to that. I don't think the Air Force commander, when he heard about it, Frank Russell, was too impressed. But it gave me a very good idea of what those brave young guys on the ground had to put up with. I mean, it was one thing sitting in an aircraft where you're familiar with your surroundings, you're familiar with the aircraft, and you're confident that you know what you're doing, to being on the ground with low visibility and where you know at any moment an ambush can be sprung and so on. Fortunately, I managed to persuade Pat Armstrong to get me pulled out before night, so I didn't have to stay there overnight.
Tol, and you had a little bit to do with PK van der Baal in those days.
Yeah, yes. Having listened to Peter Simmo's story about PK, that happened whilst I was in Mount Darwin, and Peter Rich, who'd actually become quite a good friend. He was on the first coin course with me, and that's where I first met him, was also there. And after PK had done his flying with in our helicopters during the course of the day, we had our normal JOC meeting and briefing of the minister that evening. And it was in December, so there was there'd been a lot of rain and there was a lot of water, so the terrorists didn't have a shortage of water. It made their movement through from the border, from the Kanyemba side through into the farming areas a lot easier, because they knew there were watering points. And we had explained to the minister that what we were trying to do was to deny them the water points. And he then came up with a suggestion that maybe what we should do is burn the bush. Whereupon Peter Rich responded by saying to Minister, "Where would you like us to start? Wonky."
Oh, I love that story.
Yeah. So yeah, he was very interested, of course, in what we were doing and in the war, and a very interesting gentleman all round.
Tol, I know you were involved in countless operations, but just talk about a few of the more memorable, the bigger operations that you were involved in. I know Dingo, you weren't actually supposed to be involved in, is that right? But you managed to get yourself included.
Yes, Hannes. There always seemed to be a few more aircraft than there were pilots. Throughout the war, and if I could just touch on that subject for a moment, there were never more than about 120 pilots that were current and flying on the various squadrons. So there was always really a shortage of pilots, and some of us preferred to remain current on whichever aircraft types we'd flown. And in my case, that was the Vampire and the Hunter, if we were operating out of Thornhill, and managed to persuade the squadron commander that we could contribute. And so my good friend Hugh Slatter, who was OC flying when I was the station commander at Thornhill, and I often flew on raids together, tagged onto the back of the formation, and so we were able to participate in Dingo and in the operation against the terrorist base camp in Lusaka. That was Gatling, Operation Gatling,
yes,
right?
That's right.
Yes,
Yeah, that was the
Operation
Green
Gatling.
Leader.
The Green Leader one. We were able to tag along with
Also
those.
in Vampire.
Also in a Vampire.
And what was your task?
On Dingo, it was close support and ground attack on various enemy positions where our troops were being pinned down, and in fact that's a case in point where I was able to recognise Jerry Strong's voice on the ground, and we were able to put in close support to where they were being pinned down on the ground. That particular operation as well, Peter Rich had managed to jump in, parachute in with his son, and at the debrief of the operation, Peter and I sat right in the back of the big debriefing hall, and were kind of chatting about our contribution to the operation, and Peter was telling me that, having landed on the ground with his stick, that was he had a corporal in charge there. He was told that he was facing his own troops and not to open fire. He was turn around and face the enemy. So he always had a funny story, Peter. But that was one of the really major operation, and we we all flew 3 or 4 sorties on that particular day.
And one vampire was shot down.
Yes, full Hague, very sadly. He got a small arms round into one of the main bearings supporting the engine, and the engine seized on his way back, and he carried out what looked like an almost perfect forced landing onto an open field. But the aircraft, the Vampire had virtually no protection in front of it. Beautiful cockpit and fantastic for ground attack and so on. But there was no protection in front of you. You literally sat right in the tip of the aircraft in the front. And his aircraft ran into a ditch at the end of the landing run. And unfortunately, he was crushed by the engine coming through from the back and the front of the aircraft collapsing. So that was very sad. I think very few of us got back from those raids without some damage to the aircraft from small arms fire and various other weapons that were being used against us there.
Talk a bit about the Stelas when they first came on the scene and how you reacted to the threat posed by heat-seeking missiles.
Yes, again our technicians came to the fore there. They modified the aircraft because the Stella is a heat-seeking missile, and once it's fired, once it's locked on, its hit rate is very, very high. It was a very accurate and very dangerous weapon. So the only way that we could protect ourselves was by trying to eliminate the sources of heat on the aircraft, the exhausts or the jet efflux. On jet aircraft, it's particularly difficult. We became aware of those heat-seeking missiles early in the 70s, and the tactic was to fly either above the Strela height. Generally that would be above 5,000 or 6,000 feet above ground level, or at very low level, because it did require a short period of aim before the missile would lock on. So we did become aware of that, and as we generally flew in pairs, if any one of the two aircraft noticed a Strela, we would immediately just call break, because there were a few seconds between the time it was fired and when it would hit. So you had to be very alert, and break simply meant putting the aircraft into a turn, and if you'd seen the aircraft turning towards it, pulling a maximum amount of G to give as much deflection as you possibly could. But the truth of the matter is that the missile could turn very, very sharply. It was a deadly weapon, as we were to find out later in the war with the Viscounts and with us losing some of our own aircraft to them, Hunter and Canberra.
But the Canberra that went down at Melvernia, that was the Medusa Pan operation, which involved Chris Schillenberg, I think, did the reconnaissance. Just tell us, you were involved there, and a Canberra was lost there.
Yes, that was a major operation. I had been allocated a Cessna 185 Kivit to do liaison work and airborne relay work, and to get senior Army officers and Air Force officers into close contact with the operational area and with major operations like this one was. So we realized, and you've covered this very succinctly with people like Dave Borhill and with Pete Simmons, with various other people, those were the guys that were really taking the flak in the front there. I was sitting quite comfortably some distance away and at altitude in my kivit. Once we realized that the Medusa Pan operation was fraught with danger and that we really had no alternative but to withdraw from there or lose a lot more aircraft and troops. I got a call from Ian Donaldson, who we had kept in reserve at altitude where he could conserve fuel. And he called me up and reminded me that he was carrying a full bomb box, 96 fragmentation bombs. And I immediately decided that he should go in and drop those onto the enemy positions near Medusa Pan. Now he'd been at altitude and we had 8/8 cloud cover at about 2,000 or 3,000 feet. And during the course of the operation, he'd obviously drifted from where he thought he was. And one must remember that the navigation systems were few and far between. If you were above 8/8 cloud, it was dead reckoning. And unfortunately, Ian was further north than he thought he was and descended and broke cloud directly over Malvernia, where we knew there was a strong Frelimo presence. And he was shot down there. There were a couple of police call signs close to Malvernia who heard the aircraft descend and heard the subsequent explosion and reported that they believed that an aircraft had crashed. Our attempt to call him on the radio, of course, was unsuccessful. I had gone back to Buffalo Range and dropped off my army passenger and went off again in my kivit at very low level to see if I could find the crash site. But there was a lot of small arms fire that was coming up the whole time anywhere near Malvernia. And so I literally stayed at treetop level because there was no point in just adding to the misery of having lost the Canberra. That was a really sad day. Ian Donaldson was not only a good friend, but an exceptionally good pilot, and both him and his navigator. He had a very young navigator with him, Robertson, and it was a real tragedy for us, that operation.
Tol, looking back on the use of air power in a counterinsurgency war, what are your thoughts? What did we do right? What could we have done better, maybe?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think by and large, we did most things right. And there was very good cooperation between the services. There was possibly a bit of a lack of understanding, and I've picked it up on some of your interviews, of the flexibility of the use of air power, and that there is a kind of a feeling that you, by giving every operational area or forward airfield its own aircraft, would give you flexibility. And of course, that's not the case. If you want flexibility, you've got to centralize to a substantial degree, particularly your main strike force, in order to be able to deploy them very quickly and effectively with the right weapons into the area that you need them. If you decentralize that, that flexibility doesn't exist anymore. And clearly the Air Force, being as small as it was, did come in for some criticism about the fact that it took time to get clearance and you had to fill in air task requests and so on. That didn't happen in the forward area, where your allocation may be 4 helicopters and a couple of light strike aircraft. Those were under the direct control of the people that operated in that area, be it Repulse or Tangent or wherever. But the control of the main strike force had to be centralized. As the war progressed, our Hunter and Canberra squadron sometimes did 2 or 3 airstrikes in a day in different operational areas, wherever the need was considered to be the greatest. So I think there, an understanding of the tactical and strategic use of air power, we could possibly have done a better job in informing the people on the ground what that requirement was. And it's difficult for me to talk about that without commenting on the role of the Selous Scouts and the exceptional work that they did. I was fortunate to be a young cadet and have Ron Reed Daly as my sergeant major drill instructor. So I'd known Ron literally from the day that I joined the Air Force and was involved with him in his career and subsequently when he commanded the Selous Scouts. But the Selous Scouts and the nature of their work, their operations were generally top secret, and very few people indeed had exact knowledge of what they were doing and where they were doing it. And I think there was a very fine line between keeping the operation secret and therefore retaining the element of surprise on the enemy, and giving sufficient intelligence and information to those people in the other services that were making the decisions on the use of air power. And it unfortunately led to a situation where one would sometimes say, I can't allocate aircraft to that particular operation because they're busy doing something else. And the system was then bypassed, and the scouts had direct links to ComOps, and you would simply be instructed that the aircraft will be made available. And that could be disruptive. No doubt the priorities required that to happen, but that aspect, I believe, of the war could have been improved.
So did you work with Ron operationally to any great degree? Only on the planning of some of the operations that they were involved in. And I obviously saw him whenever he was in the operational areas, whether it was repulse or wherever. I worked with these people, and very often Rob Warwicker, for instance, flew with me on a number of occasions, as did Bert Sachs, Neil Creel. A lot of their operators flew with me in my light aircraft on the various operations. So I had a fair amount to do with those guys, and they were all exceptional operators. I mean, it was great being able to work with them. Tol, that leads on to something else I want to ask you about the role of the Air Force in intelligence gathering. Where do you see a role for an Air Force in that area?
In the early days of the operation, a lot of it was done with the Canberra photo reconnaissance work, which was done at very high altitude with very sophisticated cameras for that stage of the war and at that time. So whilst I was on 5 Squadron, we did do a lot of photographic work, some of it at very long range. And frankly, when I think back on it now, some of those trips were extremely sensitive, and thank goodness we never ever lost a Canberra on any of those external long-range exercises where we were able to assess the gathering forces of Russia in particular outside of our borders, but internally as well. I think the Canberra played a very important role, and that is not to detract in any way from the work that people like Koki Bieneke and Peter Petterboyer did on a daily basis, which was in the Lynx or even in the Trojan, where they did visual reconnaissance, and both of those guys were blessed with incredible ability to pick up signs of terrorists on the ground and camps, and a lot of our strikes and our ambushes and so on were planned around the work that they did. So in that regard, yes, the Air Force did fulfill a very important role.
Yeah, that makes you, those long-range reconnaissance missions reminds me of old Chris Dixon's story about being sent on a reconnaissance mission up, I think somewhere up near the Tanzania border. And he and his navigator were given, I think, $20 or $30. Told something went wrong, they were to fly out to sea and just jump into the Indian Ocean with their $20 or $30. And Chris actually went to, I think, the CIO or something and said, please, man, can you give me a bit more cash? And I think they gave him $50. And that was what he took off with. And that was the only thing he was going to be able to do, was just go and jump into the sea. And somebody said, just wait, some passing freighter or something might pick you up. That was that.
Yeah, I had command of the Canberra Squadron, 5 Squadron, for 2 years, and the squadron was taken over by Randy Durant from me, and Chris Dixon in turn took it over from Randy. So he took command of the squadron about 4 years after I'd been there. And we did do some of those very long range trips where you were on your own with your navigator in total radio silence, and there were flights up into Tanzania. What we did do there is tag on to behind a civilian aircraft and follow a normal commercial flight up into as far as we could, so that it would only show a single radar blip, and do our photographic work. Very often you'd get to the target area, and Met services not being as good as they are now, you'd get there and it would be covered your target would be covered in cloud, and you'd have to tunnel all the way back. The only mishap that we ever had on one of those flights was Prop Geldenhuys had a single engine failure and had to fly all the way back on a single engine, but he got back safely, and we didn't lose any aircraft on those flights, but they were interesting flights.
Tol, were you involved in any way in that strike into Angola, that long-range bombing mission where they bombed the camp?
No, I wasn't involved there at all. I do know about it, obviously, and I did know about it at the time, but I wasn't involved there at all.
Tol, some of the personalities that stick out. I mean, there were lots of them, but some of them were colourful. I've already mentioned Peter Rich. I mean, Peter Rich had a very keen sense of humour, dry sense of humour, and he was an exceptional soldier and fantastic leader as well. But I can remember when we did our coin course, and the class was asked by the instructor, who I think was Rob Southey at the time, when you're going out in sort of platoon strength, where do you, as the commander of a platoon, where do you like to position yourself? In the front, so that your troops can see you and you're leading the way? Or do you want to be, in the back where you can position your troops? And Peter's response was, I'd like to be in the middle. And Rob Southey said to him, why is that? He said, because it's safest there. And that was a typical kind of Peter Rich. Chris Dixon, he was a great flyer, but he also caused a few waves in the Air Force at times. didn't take kindly to some people giving him orders, I gather.
Chris was, like many of the pilot, was he was a real character. I think he was a very good pilot. He was quite an excitable sort of a guy, as comes through when you listen to the Green Leader transmissions, particularly as they were running up to their target. But he was, he was a very competent, very good pilot. I cannot recall whether I was instructing on Chris Dixon's course or not. I think not, although I do believe that he did his operational conversion on 2 Squadron when I was commanding that.
Tol, you also did a bit of your training down in South Africa. You did the South African staff course. That I believe was a very good course.
Yeah, I think it was originally based on Bracknell, and when Bracknell became no longer available to us in Rhodesia, we were able to send two officers, normally of squadron leader or wing commander rank, to the admin course, which was 3 months, followed by the senior staff college course, which was normally about 8 or 9 months. So it was a year of staff college work, and I spent a year there. That really helped cement our relationship with the guys who were already fairly senior and became generals in the SAF. Stood us in very good stead later on in the war, when we did start cooperating more closely with them. Those were very tough courses, but the level of tuition there was exceptionally good, and I have found, certainly later in my life when I went into business, that a lot of what was taught at staff college, which was often equated to a military MBA, stood me in very good stead in business. There are very few institutions now, civilian institutions, I believe, that still teach leadership, and I don't mean management by this, I'm talking about leadership, to the extent that you would get at a military staff college.
Tol, just the tie-up with the Mirages, what was the story with the Mirage Squadron and the Rhodesian pilots?
Yes, Operation Sand, it was called. We were fortunate in that some of our pilots were selected to undergo Mirage training and fly with the Mirage Squadron. And some of them, in fact, became instructors on the Mirage. Rick Culpin comes to mind. He was an exceptionally good pilot. Mike Mulligan was one of the guys who flew there. Dayton. Mike is still a good friend, and he came off that and went back onto helicopters and had that very tragic accident. But I didn't have much to do with OpSand, and of course never flew Mirages. I was fortunate whilst I was at Staff College that the squadron commander was a guy called Zach Repsold, the Mirage Squadron, and he took me for a ride in their 2-seater Mirage, which was fun. But that's my only claim to having had anything to do with the Mirages.
But what was the arrangement with the South African Air Force on those Mirages? Was this a standby, so we might be able to use the aircraft at some stage, or what was it all about?
Yeah, it's difficult to know exactly what it was, other than it was a real plum posting, of course, for our guys, and it did give the SAF the backup, I suppose, of having additional air crew available. But I didn't see the possibility of the Rhodesian Air Force ever equipping with that kind of class of fighter. We do know that Fieldy, the airfield at Fieldy, where Green Leader strikes took place out of Fieldy, well, not the Canberras, but Fieldy was used as the main base. That had been constructed with the support of the South Africans in order to be able to operate Mirages and Buccaneers out of Fieldy. It put them very close to what were then the countries that were antagonistic towards South Africa, such as Zambia.
Tol, I know it has been said that the Rhodesian Air Force was arguably the best small air force in the world at the time, when you look at what was achieved with the resources that were available. But that unquestionably has a lot to do with the technical expertise, the ground crews that were there in support of the pilots.
Yeah, without any shadow of doubt, the Air Force could never have operated and kept the serviceability rates that it did. The helicopter techs in particular, of course, were right in the front line and were operating with the pilots and often did not get the recognition or the due which they should have got. They were almost in the background and supporting, but there was incredible dedication from those guys and ability, and it went beyond just the helicopter pilots, the helicopter techs, should I say. Supporting them at the time of UDI in 1965, there was what I think was a fairly idle boast from the UK that the Air Force would cease to exist in weeks rather than in months. Well, the fact of the matter is that many years later, we were still able to fly all 12 of the Hunters. And those engines were being completely rebuilt by the Rhodesian technical engineers. Not only those, the Canberra, the Canberras were being kept in the air by work that was being carried out in the background. Our transport fleet, the DACs in particular, were old aircraft. So, one cannot express enough praise, Hannes, for the work that was being done by the technicians, not just in the front line, but also, the guys in the background back at base that were literally rebuilding the aircraft.
Yeah, there's a story about the Alouette guys coming out from France and being amazed at what had been done with the Alouettes by the Rhodesian crews.
Yes, I personally didn't ever fly helicopters, although I must have flown many hundreds of hours in the helicopters with the guys and worked with them for long periods of time at the forward bases. It's been recorded by the helicopter pilots that you've interviewed. But those guys, they would work through the night to keep aircraft flying. It was just absolutely amazing. Nothing ever seemed to be too much of a problem to get the aircraft back into the air.
Tol, I know you were adamant about not wanting to talk about yourself, but I do know that as a squadron commander, you I think received the Janeke Trophy twice, which was awarded to the best squadron in the Rhodesian Air Force.
Yes, yes, we were fortunate, and that really just reinforces the cooperation and the work again of all of the crew, and particularly the technical staff. When I was posted to 5 Squadron, the Canberra Squadron, unfortunately, after my posting had been announced, we had the fatal accident where Alec Ruffhead and his navigator died in a crash shortly after takeoff. The Canberra took off from Salisbury, did a steep turn shortly after takeoff, and one of the wings, main attachment point to the fuselage, sheared, and the wing broke off and the aircraft plunged straight into the ground, and they were both unfortunately killed in the accident. I took over the squadron literally 2 weeks later, and there was a deep sense of depression in the squadron. Indeed, the aircrew were not at all keen to fly the aircraft, which was understandable, because although we did have non-destructive testing on metal failures, it was not nearly sophisticated as it would be now. And so my first task was to persuade the guys that we had to continue flying. And I can remember that my very first briefing of the aircrew was that I had been given command of the squadron and I intended flying the Canberra. And if there was any one of the pilots or navigators who felt unable to fly the aircraft, I would understand and I will respect their decision. I'll be in my office. I would expect anyone to come and see me within the next hour. Well, needless to say, there wasn't anybody. And a year later, we won the Janeke Trophy. Now that was a tribute to not only the operational flying, but the fact that the techs kept those aircraft in the air. You know, it was for its day, it was a sophisticated and fairly large aircraft. And we were operating it in an environment which the Canberra was never designed to fly in. It was great at high altitude, and that's where it should have been used. We were using it in Central African condition, in highly turbulent conditions, which put the wings in particular that were very straight, very large wings under huge pressure. And it's a real tribute to the techs that we kept those aircraft flying, kept them going, notwithstanding sanctions, notwithstanding all the difficulties, notwithstanding the fatality that we had, that we were able to pull the squadron together to the extent that we managed the Janeke Trophy the following year.
Tol, it was an unusual event, but you were involved in a hijacking. Black Flemington, I think, was the SAA captain.
Correct.
What actually happened there?
Yeah, that was in May 1972. We got a call from Air Force headquarters that an SAA flight from Salisbury back to Joburg had been hijacked, and that the aircraft had come back to land in Salisbury to refuel. The hijackers had told them to fly to Mauritius, and Blake Flemington had persuaded the hijackers that he didn't have enough fuel to fly to Mauritius. So they landed back in Salisbury. We were then informed by the South Africans that this had happened, and 5 Squadron, we were tasked then to try and trail the hijacked aircraft when it got airborne out of Salisbury, which it did. We, myself and my navigator, got airborne. Brown got airborne before the 727, stayed at low level until he got airborne, and then we tucked in under his tail where none of the passengers or the crew could see us. And obviously we knew what frequency he was on. So I gave Blake a call in Afrikaans, which really surprised him. And he said, "Where are you?" And I said, we're sitting under your tail and we're watching to see where you're going. He said, "Well, we've been tasked to go to Mauritius, but we've got absolutely no maps. We've got no plotting charts because we don't fly north of Salisbury." So asked my navigator to get out the maps, which he'd just taken a whole bundle of maps before we got airborne, and to quickly plot a course. As it turned out, the 727 was heading in the general direction of Nairobi, and they were already miles off course. So we gave them the new course. And in fact, Blake then said, "Well, you know, thank goodness for navigators." Because old John Brown said to me, "Gee, sir, that's the first time I've ever been called that or praised by a pilot." So we followed them out during the climb and out to beyond the Rhodesian border, when I then said to him, "Okay, we're way beyond the border now. You're on your own, and good luck." And we then returned to base. I think Blake then persuaded the hijackers that he would never make Mauritius, and that he had to land at Chileka in Blantyre, where subsequently I understand that the Malawian police stormed the aircraft, and the hijackers were taken off and arrested, and you know, there was a safe ending to that story. But I stayed in touch with Blake for quite a long time, and I think he moved to Australia or New Zealand. I don't know whether he's still around, quite honestly.
And what were your orders? Well,
initially we had, not by our Air Force, but I understand that the orders, and I didn't hear them myself, but I did understand that the orders were to shoot the aircraft down. If it got airborne and it was being hijacked, to shoot it down, which I know and I think our Prime Minister was even involved in the decision, said under no circumstances will we do that to an aircraft full of civilians. And in any case, the Canberra didn't have front guns, so there was nothing I would have been able to do.
Tol, just in closing, Le Coq d'Or was I think every Rhodesian serviceman from every service would have spent a bit of time at Coq d'Or. And I know you've got some interesting memories of time spent there.
Yeah, particularly I think during the time that I was on the Hunter Squadron, one of the flight commanders there was Rob Gaunt, who was a lifelong good friend of mine, and subsequently became a member of Parliament in Rhodesia. But Rob and I went back for many years, and Rob and I had done a flight beyond the borders, and on one of the early externals, and had landed back at New Serum, and as often was the case, we would go to the Le Coq d'Or, the watering hole, where a lot of the Army and Air Force guys would have a drink after operations or when they were on R&R, during the course of which I think the Air Force contingent got a little bit noisy and loud, and the manager came over and wanted to know who was in charge, and Rob said, "I am." So the manager said to him, "Well, you're making too much noise, you must keep quiet." Rob in no uncertain terms then told him to piss off. So we carried on, and about 5 or 10 minutes later, the manager was back trailing this telephone cable behind him with a telephone, and said to Rob, "I've got a call for you." So Rob grabbed the phone and said, "Gaunt here," whereupon the voice on the other side said, "McLaren here."
Commander of the Air Force.
The commander of the Air Force. Rob said, "When I heard the commander's voice, I was dismayed." Yeah, that was...
And what did McLaren say? Get there out of
No, in fact, McLaren demanded Rob's attention in his office the following morning at 8 o'clock at Air Force headquarters to explain what had happened. But I must say, even on incidents like that, and the police as well, the BSAP were fantastic in that regard. They accepted the fact that the guys would let their hair down a bit when they came back from operations, and they were always kind of sympathetic towards the troopies that came back and that were on R&R. So there was very little serious damage done.